following a summer of unrest across the country and right here in Columbus. Calls for change and police reform.
Community leaders fighting to resolve issues of racism and inequality.
Hands up, don't shoot!
ABC6 not only covering the story, but helping to spark an important conversation.
Racism is real. I will not tolerate it.
Bringing together city leaders, the police, and community activists for a town hall discussion on how to unite the community.
They want change, and they want it now.
Tonight, we continue that mission as we hear from important voices with one common mission: to make this city a better place for all of us.
Good evening. I'm Rodney Dunnigan along with Stacia Notkin. We're glad you're here for this ABC6 Town Hall Voices for Change, working to move the conversation forward when it comes to race relations and policing in the city of Columbus, along with the spike in gun violence.
You're going to hear from city council, community activists, police, and police families as we move this conversation forward. We're focused on policy and meeting the needs of the young people they serve. You're going to hear from change makers tonight. We hope to cover a lot of ground. So let's get started.
And we do start tonight with two guests who've been at the forefront of the discussions on reimagined policing. Sergeant James Fuqua with the Columbus Police Department, who also works as the Diversity Inclusion Liaison within the department, and community organizer with the People's Justice Project, Jasmine Ayers, who also serves as part of the working group to develop the City Civilian Police Review Board. And Jasmine, I do want to start with you. Obviously, it's been a few months now since the protests and the demonstrations that we saw this summer, and the mayor's office, along with the police department, promised a number of changes. Now, from your prospect and from your perspective of how things have gone, have you seen that change?
So I think that there have been several things that have passed that they sort of promised, right? We put limits on no-knock warrants. They're now going to be doing deeper investigations into a police officer's background before they hire them. But the real substantive change that they have promised has not happened yet. We've not seen that pass. The things that, let's say, got Tyree King killed, the 13-year-old young man, like nothing has changed within the department that would have prevented something like that from happening.
Jasmine, when you look at the Civilian Review Board and the formation there, what kind of discussions are happening right now for the members, the future members of that board? What kind of discussions are happening for educating those members on what police training is like, the science of policing?
Right, so we have had a number of experts come in and share what other civilian review boards look like in other cities. There is a former Columbus police officer that is on the task force. And so we've been able to get insights sort of when it comes from that angle. And the conversations that we're having right now are really the specifics. How many years is somebody's term going to be? Are we going to have term limits? Are people going to be appointed? Are they going to be elected? We're also trying to do some innovative things like make sure that we have a social worker available, right? Like we don't want people to just come fill out a piece of paper and then leave, right? Like we understand that these are traumatic events, and for some people, this is the first time that anybody has ever looked them in the face and said, I believe you and I trust you, and we're gonna take the time to investigate what's going on. So we're trying to put together sort of the best of what's out there and create some of our new things, some of our own things.
Sergeant Fuqua, when you hear Jasmine talk there, obviously you've been with this department for some time. You were born and raised in this community. What do you think can be done to kind of bridge that gap between the community, those folks who are working in the community, and the police department?
Sure, Rodney. You know, the biggest thing anytime there's a situation, a high-profile incident, specifically with the police department here in Columbus and the community, that obviously is always going to have like a lot of eyes on it. So a lot of people have called for reimagining the police this year, a lot of police reform and all these other things. One of the most important things to note is that Chief Quinlan takes all of this very seriously. You know, Mayor Ginther appointed him to be the change agent. That is why he appointed him to be the chief of police. And what's so important about that is Chief Quinlan takes the information from the Matrix report that is very well documented, as well as the Public Safety Advisory Committee's recommendations. And to this point, We are already working through some of those recommendations, some of the things we are already doing, but at the end of the day, the bottom line is we have completed nearly 70% of the Safety Advisory Committee recommendations and over 50%, over half of the Matrix report. So I think a lot of it starts with the change that the community has asked for, and these things that the community and Jasmine are asking for are in these reports. So we're working diligently to see this to fruition 100% on both lists.
Sergeant, this is a complicated time to be a police officer in any community, and especially an officer of color. What do you say to future officers as you go out to recruit? Because I know that part of your job is focused on diversity in our law enforcement officers. So what's your message about what this job is like right now?
So my message actually has not changed even with the pandemic and all the social unrest in 2020. Like Rodney said, I am a lifelong resident of Columbus. I'm born and raised Southside, very proud of that. And I often talk about how I got here. And how I got here was I did not have a very healthy relationship with police officers growing up in my neighborhood in the early to mid 90s as a youth. And there was a lot of mistrust in the community for police officers. And to be quite frank, I didn't like cops, didn't trust them, didn't want anything to do with them. But what happened was I ended up meeting an officer of color that is well documented, Officer Alan Blackman, who actually is about to retire after 30 plus years of dedicated service to the city. And he actually said that he thought I would be very good for the job. And I said, I'm not doing a ride along, because that's what he suggested. I said, I'm not sitting in the back seat of a cop car. I've been back there before. I'm not doing that again, right? So he's like, no, you ride in the front seat. So I did a ride along. And I'll never forget, I did an overnight shift, and it completely changed my life. And the reason why that is so important is I was able to see, just like in any other profession, that 99% of guys out there do a phenomenal job, and they work really, really hard at it. So that is what drove me to do the job. So it's the same message that I got back in 1999 when I first had the interest, and I would still tell people today. If you really want to be the change in your community, then do something about it. Don't just complain about the police. Put this white shirt on just like I do every day and go out and make a difference in your community.
Jasmine, have you done a ride-along? Would you be open to that?
I have done several.
What did you come away with from those opportunities and that experience?
So my experience with a ride-along, like Sergeant Fuqua said, most officers are out there doing what they're supposed to be doing, but it's akin to calling a plumber to fix an electrical problem. Right, like our problem is poverty and sort of lack of investment from the city, and you call the police after something has happened. And what we are advocating for is prevention. And so while I appreciate what they do, and like you said, most officers are out there doing their job is not actually to prevent crime, right? Like we need more investment, we need more after-school programs, we need streetlights, and there are neighborhoods where the trash doesn't even get picked up every week. They just don't come. And so, again, right, we're asking them to do too much, and we're asking them to do things that they weren't trained to do. And so while I appreciate my experience, I think that our city officials need to step up and invest in our neighborhoods.
You know, Sergeant Fuqua, I want to talk to you about the mental aspect and what all of this does to officers. Obviously, you heard Jasmine mention there, not all officers are bad, but unfortunately, for the past few months, that's been the spotlight and the word, so to speak, on officers, not only here in Columbus, but across the country. Just what sort of impact does this have on an officer like yourself who really cares and has a passion for the community and those good officers on the force?
Well, I want to first commend Jasmine for what she said, because she's absolutely spot on when she is talking about police officers in 2020, not just in Columbus, Ohio, but all across this country are asked to do things that even when I started back in 2004, we weren't doing then. We are asked to be counselors, we are asked to be social workers, we are asked to be peacekeepers, guardians, give credit advice. I can't tell you how many times in my career and many officers where we have to help people physically move because they can't afford their rent and they have to go from place to place and they don't even have someone in their life that can help them. Officers do so many things behind the scenes beyond just writing traffic tickets or taking someone to jail that people don't know about, and she's absolutely right. we have been asked to take on far too much in this job. And it is up to us to continue to reimagine ways that we can get the resources we need to help facilitate doing the job better.
And I want to ask you quickly, just to follow up, discussions like this. How can we have discussions like this between police officers and community leaders without it necessarily being on television, but just, to kind of bridge this gap? How can we do that?
Well, one thing, as a matter of fact, I actually met Jasmine years ago at a community event, and we could not have had more different views on how we do the job, right? But I respected where she was coming from, and I understood her point and her position. So the point is to continue to have community engagement with people who are not like-minded and come up with a way to make things better. But we have to be cordial and respectful. Otherwise, it's pointless if we can't sit down. So if you don't like a police officer, you have to separate the job from the person and the agenda trying to get things done.
Would you agree with that, Jasmine?
I'm in on that?
Yeah.
Okay. So I would say it's the same group of officers that show up to the same community events. And those aren't the people that need to be there, right? And so I think what I would like to see is before you even get a gun, you should have to walk a beat in the neighborhood. You should have to get to know the city. The majority of officers do not live in Columbus. They don't grocery shop here. They don't send their kids to school here, right? Like, they're not invested. And until they actually spend some time eating here, getting to know people, going to the community meetings, going to the high school football games, the dialogue is happening between the same groups of people. And so we need all of the officers to participate in these community conversations, and we need them on the front side when they're fresh to get into the community and spend time and get to know people so that they're not afraid of the folks that they see.
And the thing I would like to add to that is we're bound by contracts. Everyone knows there are certain things that prevent officers having the ability to do some of the things you're asking for because of collective bargaining and all of that, but I don't want to bore the viewers with that type of thing. The most important thing I want to stress is that, we're all human beings, okay? Every one of us has to go out and do the job. Quite frankly, Rodney, the most impressive thing that I could say about our police department right now is the fact that we have the lowest amount of people who are calling off work or injured. The bottom line is, during a pandemic, during the social unrest, all the stress that we deal with, we have officers coming to work every day, putting their life on the line, still doing their job, regardless of whether or not people in the public, whether it's perceived or real, do not like us. And the mental health is wearing. In 2020, I often talk about police officer is the most difficult job in the world. And the reason why this is so important and it's so difficult is I have to, as many people see, report to you and everyone else in the media about another homicide. And quite frankly, not just me, but we're all sick of it. We are sick and tired of seeing young people, specifically young people of color for me, because I'm still a black man first and I grew up here. We're tired of seeing that. We take this serious. We take this personally. Officers having to see day after day after day the violence, and everyone expects us to go home to our families and be normal. Like, that's not okay. And the mental health of being a police officer, not just here, but across the nation, is troubling. So we just want people to know that we are still continuing to come to work and doing our job to the best of our ability, and I am proud to say that I work here. Now, I'm not going to sit here and sugarcoat it. Do we have work to do? Absolutely. Are there things that our department needs to work on? Sure. But at the end of the day, we're working hard every day to keep the citizens here safe.
All right. Well, we thank you all for coming. Some great discussion here. And of course, as this discussion continues over reimagined policing, there is one group that we haven't heard from just yet: law enforcement families.
Families going into hiding, targeted during this time of change, all due to their loved one's profession. It is a perspective that adds another layer to this complicated evolution. You're going to hear from them next. As the protests continued into the summer, highlighting the cases of police brutality, many officers continued their mission, giving back to the community.
That's right. And for many, a big focus has been on kids and making a difference in their lives. Here are just a few of those examples. Bridging Bridging the gap between police and neighborhoods, the Beatty Community Center filled for the annual Cops and Barbers event with a few changes due to COVID.
Everything was a little bit different. We didn't even know in the beginning if we were going to be able to have an event this year. With health and safety restrictions.
The focus, young men from across the city, helping them get ready for the school year with a fresh cut and needed school supplies. But the event's founder says the mission is much deeper.
You take a young person, you provide them with an opportunity like this, an interaction like this, it can change the tone of their life. One of these young folks could decide if they want to go into law enforcement, or it could change their perception on law enforcement. And with everything we've been through over the past 4 months, I feel it's more important now than ever.
Making a difference in the community, one cut and one kid at a time. And check out this event. Officers teaming up with the nonprofit Starfish Assignment to deliver 75 bikes to kids in the Hilltop. Police worked with community leaders to identify the kids most in need. Volunteers telling us every kid deserves a chance to have fun and a smile. This, department leaders say, is a part of their mission to truly connect with those they serve. And of course, that is the kind of work that our next guest feels should be highlighted even more as community policing evolves. They're with the Central Ohio Police Families Association.
We want to welcome the association president, vice president, and a board member with us today. Now, we're not using your names at your request just because of some safety issues that you all have faced this summer in particular. Tell us how this summer sparked the formation of the Central Ohio Police Families Association.
This summer has been one of the toughest times to be a law enforcement family that we've ever faced. We met because of a peer support call from the National Police Wives Association during the riots after our spouses had been targeted. I know myself personally, I'd never been a part of anything like this, and one night I was driving down to the corner store to get some ice cream for my kids, and a car came up behind me very aggressively, swerved up next to me and ran me up onto the sidewalk, screaming obscenities and threats, calling me a pig because I had a thin blue line sticker this big on the back of my vehicle. And that was scary, but what was worse was the next morning when I walked out into the garage and saw my husband with a razor blade scraping that sticker off of my vehicle. It was the first time that I thought, I need help, I need support. And so that's how I met these ladies and several other that are in our organization.
When you guys, experience what your husbands and spouses and friends go through as far as the criticism that they've gotten over the past few months, just as families, how does it feel personally to see the impact that it's having on them if they have the passion and the care for this community to serve and to see what they go through and what they come home to after their shifts? Just personally as a family, how does it make you feel?
For me, it felt different because of the protest. Suddenly, our race became an issue. My husband shouldn't have to worry about being called names and told to join the protest because of his race. He became a police officer to serve his community.
And is that, that's an interesting, Sergeant Fuqua, he even mentioned that for a lot of, obviously the summer, these protests, a lot of them were, racially motivated and things like that. Just to discuss that, stress that, because a lot of the officers, especially with the Columbus Police Department, they are African American, so they deal with the same issues that were, being addressed this summer, but yet they still have to serve the community, and a lot of folks don't see that connection.
I would say that most police officers become police officers because they want to serve their community. They don't look at their race or anybody else's race. And if you go on ride-alongs, like Sergeant Fuqua said, it's the same way with the officers. I've been on a lot of ride-alongs, and I've learned a lot about police officers because of the integrity and the way they treat people.
Now, when these protests were happening downtown, and a lot of that was focused in the downtown area, when your officers, the officers in your lives, went back out into the communities and the neighborhoods specifically that they serve, what did they see? Was there a difference as the protests were happening downtown?
From my experience, I know my husband, when he went back to the areas that he normally serves in, he was just like, nothing changed here. It's still the same. The riots happened downtown, but it didn't change. There were no riots in those communities. It was still the same people, dope houses, the same people looking for help with those situations, the same, just kind of the same thing happening. Nothing much changed in the outskirts of the city, in those suburb areas of the inner city.
But in your house, a lot changed during those protests. You faced some real issues of safety as well.
Yes. During the protests, there were threats on my officer and on our family, which at the time we didn't, we were like, whatever, it just happens. But at the time, you don't know what to take seriously and what to not. So we did remove from the home while he was down there just for our safety, and kind of took that time and just awaited those times in between. They were working such long shifts, so waiting those 2-minute phone calls every 12 hours or so, whenever he would have a minute to be like, okay, still doing good down here, whatever, update me. But yes, we did kind of remove, and my kids had no idea, of course. They felt like, oh, we're going to go somewhere, it's going to be a party, it's just us, but my oldest child, kind of, he's 9, and so he's picking up on some things. So he's like, something's not right, but mom seems to be having a good time, so I'm going to roll with it, kind of thing. So a little stressful, though.
When you all look at the change that's happened in our community, how does that change the way you feel about your officer and their role in the community? Or does it change?
It's changed a lot of things in relationships with long-lasting friendships that unfortunately have dissolved because people feel that they do have to pick a side. Family relationships have been damaged. But I will tell you, new relationships have been formed with people who understand this lifestyle, that it's different. And it's one that you don't get into, you don't take it on lightly. You have to have a servant's heart to be an officer, and also to be in love with one. To know that when your officer goes out there, that's my daughter's dad, that's my mother-in-law's son, and he's going out there to protect the vulnerable. And I couldn't be more proud of him. Watching during the riots, tucking your kids into bed and then hustling back to your phone to watch the live stream of what's going on and having it on your TV on another channel, and wondering if you're going to see him, having objects thrown at him, having people screaming in his face. That's something I'll never forget. But I couldn't be more proud of his professionalism and the fact that he still does it every day.
Do you all think if more people heard these personal stories, because we don't hear of these stories a lot, do you think if people heard these stories, it would give them a totally different perspective of police officers?
For me, my officer is in the community. Our community, my community, really stepped up during the riots at my neighborhood. I posted a Facebook post and I asked if people wanted to support us to PM me. And I got loads and loads of water, Gatorade, snacks to deliver to the different precincts for the officers. So the surrounding community where we live, they care about us because they see how we live our life every day. But it's the people who don't know, the people who get stereotypes are stereotypes. And it's not, there are good officers out there doing good things. And people need to realize that our officers are human beings serving their community because they chose to.
And you mentioned the fact about friends and family having to choose a side. And that's where, unfortunately, a lot of the community lies right now. What do you think can be done to bridge that divide? Because, you know, we've discussed a bit already today just about the recent violence in Columbus. So we know we need police officers. What can be done, do you think, to bridge that divide?
It's more than changing your profile picture. It's more than holding a sign. It's getting involved. It's having action. It's going into these communities. If you want to change them, don't talk about it, be about it. Do something, volunteer, mentor, come on a ride along, talk to folks that are doing mentoring programs at rec centers that are springing up basketball leagues, places to give kids something to do so that we can get a handle on this violence that, is going on with our young people. Get involved. Don't just change your profile picture and don't just talk about it. Do something. Get involved in these communities if you want to help them, because that's what our officers do 40 plus hours a week, is they interact with the community, they protect the vulnerable, and they take care of the predators.
We appreciate your time, all three of you, and what you're bringing to this conversation. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thanks. Thank you.
And still to come tonight, there are so many members, of course, of this community, members taking to the streets right now and working to solve problems and help to bridge that divide.
We're going to highlight just some of the work happening right here in Columbus as Voices for Change continues right here on ABC6. Over the summer, we saw a number of protests and demonstrations.
That's right. And one of the most impressive was organized by men in the Black community looking to display a positive image and send one very important message.
We are not alone today.
A message of hope and a call for change.
When I say Black lives, you say matter. Black lives! Black lives!
Black men from throughout the Columbus community gathering to send a message to display excellence.
We know that oftentimes in the community and abroad, Black men are labeled as thugs or violent or aggressive. We know that's not true.
Men of all ages calling for an end to discrimination and injustice.
In the past, it was always one race doing it, and when all the races coming together and being supportive, it's going to be hard to beat that combination.
This summer march, simply the beginning. Organizers stressing it's the action that must follow.
There are big discussions happening related to policy, and we're going to talk more about that coming up. But our next guests aren't waiting for policy. They're out making a difference in their communities.
And this guy has a lot of titles: rapper, entrepreneur, attorney, former Buckeye, and current member of the Big Ten's Anti-Hate and Anti-Racism Coalition. Mecca Don is here. Also joining us, a viral sensation known as Ohio's Dancing Cop. He's creating positive interactions with young people in the community that he grew up in, Officer Anthony Johnson.
And we've also got Pastor Michael Young of City of Grace Church. He was one of the organizers of the Men's March this summer that you just saw about. And the entire month of October, volunteers from his church have been passing out thousands of boxes of food to families hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. Pastor Young, I'm going to start with you. When we talk about food boxes, we are talking about meeting one of the most basic needs for our neighbors out there right now. How have you seen that create connection and encouragement?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're in an unprecedented times. We're in the midst of a pandemic. We've had protests all throughout the summer dealing with systemic racism. So what we're trying to be is a positive influence in the midst of a pandemic. And just to see literally hundreds upon hundreds of families show up every Saturday to get their meat, their produce, and their dairy goods, we really want to be a source of hope and inspiration. And what we've tried to do is not just make it a City of Grace thing. We've tried to reach out to other entities and organizations within Columbus to come partner with us to really make it a collaborative community effort. So it's not only blessed the people getting the food, it's been a blessing to us as well.
And Officer Johnson, why do you think it's important for you to connect with the kids in the community the way you do, especially through dance? I mean, obviously, we've all seen your viral videos. Why do you think it's important to kind of meet them at their level, so to speak?
I think it's important to be a ray of light in somebody's life. Pretty much any day that you go out there, at the end of the day, we're all humans. We all have needs. We all have wants. So if you could bring positivity to somebody's life or a family's life, even if it's dancing and embarrassing yourself, why not do it?
And Mecca, I know obviously you're well known in the community. Just the importance of someone like yourself stepping up and, trying to make a difference, not waiting on the police department or the mayor's office. You actually, getting on the ground floor and kind of helping out.
Yeah, I mean, I think the conversations are important. If momentum is important. And I think if you look at, there's some negative things that happen, but there's a lot of positive that's come out of this period of time. particularly people being engaged, more people being engaged and being willing to listen and understand different perspectives and different viewpoints. So I think to continue to amplify the voices and make sure that the momentum stays for change is very, very important. And I think that people who have platforms, it's incumbent on them to do so. So that's been something that's been pretty important for me.
Mecca, why does this fight belong to all of us? When it comes to reaching out and getting to know each other, how can people step in? Because it really is going to take everyone.
Yeah, I think first it's important for people to be honest, right? And I think that part of the honesty is, self-examination and also examination of the community and even and broader than that, the entire country. What got us here? And I think it's important for people to do that first before they engage in conversations. But also realizing that, and this pandemic is a perfect example of us all being connected, right? And what you do can affect what's happening over in Indiana, literally today. So I think that type of understanding, I think, is a lot of people are starting to see that a lot more. Like, wow, we really are all connected. Even if it's just something that I'm doing locally, I think that it doesn't matter to someone else. No, it does. And this pandemic has been a perfect example of that. So I think if people can really start to understand, first of all, that their voice matters, their vote matters, so to speak, and that they can what they do can actually influence somebody many states away, I think that could really, really start to get us closer to the change that we're looking for.
As we all look for these opportunities to step in, Officer AJ, if you'd found a connection with someone as a young person in the community that you serve now, if you'd found that connection earlier in life, what kind of difference do you think that could have made for you?
It would have made a huge difference. I met somebody that helped change the trajectory of my life when I was 19 years old. If I would have met them when I was 13 or 10 years old, I can't imagine where I would be at today, which is why it's so important to go into these communities, despite what the community may look like, and invest in the youth. They're the future of this country. They're the future of this world. So why not make the greatest investment and invest in them?
Pastor Young, to start this segment, we talked about the Men's March this summer and how impactful that was, just talking about image. Something like that, how important is that to show the community what black men are as opposed to what people may think they are? Why was an event like that so important?
Yeah, it's incredibly important because what we want to do is change the narrative. To your point, there are a lot of implicit bias that are associated with the image of black men. And I think from many people's perception, black men are probably the most devalued and maybe mischaracterized category of people in our nation. Many times there's the term thug attached to them. And when I think about the march, one of the most inspirational moments of the march, there's literally over 1,000 black men marching together, and our executive pastor from our church was leading the chant, and he made the chant, I am not a thug, I'm a black man. And you could literally feel it reverberate through that crowd of 1,000 black men, and just the source of inspiration and pride in their blackness. I think that's incredibly important. The reality is as far as black men are concerned, we operate at high levels on all segments and sectors of our society, you being the example. We got lawyers and doctors. We have people who are contributing in a positive way, and we want to make sure that that's the narrative versus what sometimes can dominate our TV screens and things of that nature.
And I know part of what you do, too, in your community service, you try to not only bring in those community volunteers, but you do bring in police officers to show that, unity. The importance of that, of you being one of those, we're talking about bridging that divide, and you're serving as a bridge, so to speak. The importance of more people stepping up and doing that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we should be attempting to do is build bridges and not walls. And one of the reasons is I think it's much easier to have a difficult conversation if you have a relationship established. So somebody like Officer AJ, he's in the community. If there's something that I don't understand about what a police officer has done, what he personally has done, I can go to him as a brother, somebody who I know is in the community, and we can have that healthy conversation. Even if we choose to disagree at the end, I know him as a person and as a man first, and a police officer second. So I think building that relationship, seeing a black man beyond the surface of the color of his skin, seeing a police officer beyond what their badge looks like, I think is incredibly important.
Now, Mecca, each of you have mentioned the importance of reaching out to young people in particular. Why do you think that a young person right now could really be the most significant change when you reach out to connect with someone right now?
Yeah, I think if you look at kind of any significant movement that's ever happened, really, anywhere. It's always started with young people, because young people have a lens of the world that we don't necessarily see. So that's very important. And to piggyback Pastor's point as well, I think Officer AJ, him being in the community, people like that, that's very important to establishing relationships. I think it's just like kind of like, for example, a medical doctor. They need to understand the circumstances of their community before they can serve that community. And officers, same thing. If they're serving the community, they need to understand the specifics of that community. There's certain things that are very specific to that community that don't happen elsewhere. And they're also, I think the other thing that's very important is to understand that nobody really wants violence. Nobody wants to be downtrodden. That's not a situation anybody would choose. So that's why I always think it's important when we talk about these things that we talk about how things are now, but also talk about the root causes, and we try to address both of those things at the same time. And you'll realize when you get in these communities and you talk to these kids that a lot of them want different than what they're seeing and what's happening. And that should be enough inspiration for us to go and lead for them.
Officer AJ, how do you make sure that the young people you come into contact with feel important? Because so many young people feel like, I'm just a kid, I don't count, my voice doesn't matter. How do you build them up to make sure they know they matter?
Well, I think knowledge is key when we're talking about something like that. And when I say knowledge is key, knowing their worth. Knowing the power that they have, knowing the power that their voice carries, letting them know that despite their age, they could go out and conquer the world, and that they could change policies, and they could build these relationships that will forever shape the future of our world. So when I go out here, you may see the lighthearted videos where I'm dancing with kids and playing basketball and whatnot. But what happens when the cameras is off is we're having these hard conversations, whether it's the youth asking me, AJ, I just seen this video of this officer doing this. Can you explain it? Or me explaining to the kids like, hey, this is going on in this neighborhood. Can you steer clear this area right now? So, when I say knowledge is important, it's important. It's a two-way street. It's important for me to know what's going on in the community. It's important for the community to know what's going on in the police department as well.
And Officer AJ, when you have these discussions with the kids in the community, do you see their perception of police officers change? I mean, can you see an immediate change, or what do you see?
Sometimes it's not immediate, sometimes it is. But what I'll say is that's the most rewarding part of my job. It's better than the benefits, it's better than the paycheck, it's better than anything that goes with this job. When you see that light bulb click, and I'm no longer Officer Johnson or Officer AJ, I'm AJ. And when their parents text my cell phone and they go, hey, he has straight A's. Are you going to hold your deal of the bargain and buy him a suit or take him out to dinner or whatnot? So it's extremely rewarding, and it's extremely important that they see past the uniform and that they see who I am behind the badge.
And Mecca, for you, what do you think the community's responsibility is in kind of sparking some of these discussions and helping with the change?
I think all of this starts with honesty, right? So I think part of it is again, I don't think you can have these conversations without evaluating the history and how we got certain places. But then once you've done that and you try to attack that, you also do have a responsibility to try to deal with the circumstances as they are. Martin Luther King said, it's a cruel jest to tell a bootless man to pick himself up by his bootstraps. But you still have to do it anyway, right? Because ultimately, you are kind of responsible, you and your family are kind of responsible for your fate. And so I think that it's important that we have these tough conversations, and mentors and people like us who care about these young kids continue to have these conversations and pull out from them their greatness, because a lot of times they don't see it. And particularly sometimes they're blinded by their environment and things that they see and the role models, so to speak, in their environment. So I think it's important that we, as leaders, continue to develop programs, right? We continue to fight for them systemically and policy-wise, but also encourage them and pull out their greatness.
Now, Pastor Young, as we wrap up this particular part of the conversation, we know this is not a sprint, this is a marathon. How do we steady ourselves for the real work that's ahead?
Yeah, I think I'm a person who preaches and practices purpose. And I believe, look at these two men to my right, I believe they're operating in purpose, and I think associated with purpose is passion. So I think when we get small victories, I think we need to celebrate them. But while we get these small victories, we can't take our eye off the ultimate goal, which is we want equality and really we want it to be an equitable community and society. So I think we got to be each other's cheerleaders. I think we got to root each other on as we all work towards this common goal.
Thank you all so much for being here and contributing to this conversation. Now, as the community works to connect and that conversation continues, there are big questions about the next steps. How do we move toward meaningful change?
And a major plea for people to put down the guns. That's next when Voices for Change returns right here on ABC 6.
Fighting systemic racism. Where do we start? What kind of policy will it take for meaningful change? What will actually make a difference in the communities? These are some big questions. There's no simple answer, but we know this conversation is important. Our next guest has some insight into that process. Stephanie Hightower, the president and CEO of the Columbus Urban League, joins us now. We appreciate your time. Where do we start with this? Policy to make a difference is going to take time, but the first step is key. So where do we begin?
You know, having conversations like these tonight is that step to begin the process. First, we've got to heal. So we've got to go through a recovery process, and then we have to look at the resiliency that this country has always stood on, and then we have to look at that reform. And so, you know, one of the things that this community is starting to look at is the Civilian Review Board. And so that's the kind of reform and policy to begin to have those conversations, and especially with the people, to then begin to have this sense of healing.
Family stabilization is a core strategy for the Columbus Urban League. How can policy guide that goal when we're talking about families?
You know, first we have to take a look at the fact that a lot of our policies in this community and even in this country, they are racist policies. They are policies that basically equate to inequality. And so if you don't have policies that actually will look at affordable housing, if we don't look at policies about how people are evicted, if we don't look at policies that extended way back for how redlining basically made our communities and certain neighborhoods distressed, then we won't be able to begin to have change. So we've got to take a look at those inequities when you start looking at the wealth gap, when you start looking at inequalities in income. Then we can begin to talk about how housing stabilization will then be stabilized in this community. But affordable housing right now is almost non-existent in Columbus, Ohio, and Franklin County.
Well, and then we add the pandemic on top of that, which we know has hit minority communities especially hard, both physically with the virus and then also economically. So how do we begin healing as a community in that area while also focusing on our neighbors of color?
So, you know, people have to recognize that these disparities just didn't happen overnight. And so COVID, as you just pointed out, has illuminated those disparities. What is real for me, what's encouraging is that now that there has been this awakening in this country and people actually understand these disparities, you know, we're doing things like we're going to be hosting an event called the 1,000 Cut Journey in a couple of weeks, because people have to understand what systemic racism actually is. People have to understand what being an anti-racist is. If you believe in racist policies, then you're a racist. And so we have to begin to talk about those things, and then we have to begin to look at implementation. And our elected officials, I have to say, from the mayor to our city council president and our city council members and our other county commissioners, they are beginning to have those kinds of conversations. They're putting their money where their mouth is. County commissioners are putting money, as well as the city, into small business resiliency. They're putting money into making sure that people have stable housing, and so we're giving free rent. Not free rent, but we're making sure that people can have rent and mortgage assistance. Those are the kinds of things we have to do to stabilize our community for those who have been, unfortunately, in unequal situations for a very long time.
The folks out here who are watching, the individual at home who says, what can I do? Where do I start? What's your advice?
Do your homework, do your research, understand our history. Reach out to those people who don't look like you and have a better understanding for why they are where they are. We can't judge people. Trust me, people who don't have a good education, they want their children to have a good education. Folks who live in distressed neighborhoods, they want to live in the same kind of neighborhoods you live in. They want to have relationships with their banking institutions, small businesses. They want to be able to have the kinds of neighborhood revitalization that goes on. They don't want to have distressed neighborhoods where there's food insecurity there. Those are the kinds of things we have to begin to talk about. And really, it's about empathy, really understanding and being aware that empathy is how we begin to have those crucial conversations, and we can make a difference.
Stephanie, thank you for being here tonight. We really appreciate your time. Now, we know our city is in the midst of a storm of gun violence right now. In fact, just days ago, a shooting and crash hurt 3 young kids in Italian Village.
Columbus is just getting kind of tough out here, that's all. You shoot children in broad daylight.
We hear people saying that there was kids in the car, and I'm just standing there praying that nobody's children were hurt, because nobody deserves to have that kind of weight put on top of them.
It's terrible, especially children. Maybe we need some more police protection out here in the neighborhoods.
And joining us now to discuss those issues of violence in the city of Columbus, Columbus City Council President Shannon Hardin. Shannon, you had some pretty strong words to mention this exact shooting in Italian Village. Just, your thoughts on the recent violence in the city first off.
Yeah, Rodney, thank you again for having this important conversation. And I agree with just about everything that I heard this evening about us coming together and about putting each other, get that proximity, getting closer to one another. But what I saw this week, truthfully, and what we have seen way too much of this year, really put me over the edge, and it was really important that we all get some type of anger and frustration. This is not a sentiment that I feel because I'm council president. It's a sentiment that I feel because I live in Columbus and that I know and love children. It makes no sense. And there's a lot of things that I understand about this year. I understand that Columbus has nearly a 10% unemployment rate. I understand that folks aren't able to go to school and they're disconnected. I understand that this is literally one of the toughest years that any of us will live through. I understand that there is mistrust in our law enforcement and policing, but what I don't understand is why somebody would pick up a gun and use that against, especially shoot up a car full of children. That's unacceptable. And regardless of where you fall on any of these issues, we have to be able to call that out and say enough is enough and that this has to stop.
What do you think the community, the entire community's role is in addressing this issue?
Well, I think we look a lot to folks who have titles, and that is an important role too. The city has a role to play. The state has a role to play. We have too many guns on our street. But really, this is on all of us now. This is on all of us. So, I'm as I think there's as much on the title of auntie and uncle and coach and mentor as there is on council member. We're all know young people. We all have proximity. We all have somebody that trusts us. We can use our voice. We can use our influence. We can mentor. This is a hard, tough year. We don't have some of the tools that we would normally use pre-pandemic to arrest violence and pull things in. We can't open up our rec centers. We can't do that one-on-one touch that we normally do. But individuals, we know people. Pastors know folks. Coaches know young folks. They can pull them in. We can pull them. And so I'm calling on really the entire community. Let's stack hands. Because the thing that I love about this city the most is that a kid on the south side is still my kid. The kid on the west side up in Linden, those are still my kids. And that matters to us. And it's that type of empathy, it's that type of outreach and engagement that will keep us safe and move us forward.
I want to connect what's happening now and the protest this summer. We heard a lot about defunding police. And, some people even said abolish the police. Do you think what we've experienced here in the city of Columbus over the past month, past few weeks, would change that thinking for some folks?
What I believe is that what folks went out into the streets, started in Minneapolis and came through the streets of Columbus, was about accountability, was asking for a change and reform. I think that we're going down that path. now, truthfully, the choice and the work is in the voters' hands. We have an issue on the ballot, issue 2, that if voted for by the citizens of Columbus, will create a civilian review board and independent investigatory body. We all know that we have great police officers, and great police officers don't want their names sullied by bad officers who keep getting away with things that they shouldn't get away with. We need trust in law enforcement that will help us create that trust in the communities. The communities that are experiencing the most trauma and violence are the communities that need to have the strongest relationships with our police officers. And I think that the issue 2, which again, voters have that in their hands as we talk about a reform agenda and talking about building a community that is good and where everyone feels safe, regardless of what your zip code and certainly regardless of what your skin color is. We all have a role to play in the next 13 days. You can vote yes on issue 2 so that we can create that. We can vote yes on issue 24 that will create more trauma-informed care so that we don't always have to have an armed police officer come to the scene. When my next door neighbor, who's 85 and has dementia, has an incident with her grandson, we maybe not always don't need an armed police officer. Maybe we could have someone from NetCare come out to that instance. Those things are on the ballot. Some of this stuff takes all of us stacking hands and to move us forward and create that safer Columbus.
Just quickly for us, a final word on the violence, just addressing that to those folks out there who are committing the crimes, those folks out there who know who's committing the crimes. Just a final word for those folks.
I mean, it's simple. First of all, as your council president, as a kid who grew up in South Columbus and Southfield, I see you. It is tough. This is, again, the toughest year that most of us will ever live through. But if you think that picking up a gun and using that against someone is any way to solve any issue, then there's two outcomes that will come from that. Either you will lose your life to the streets, or you will lose your life to the criminal justice system, and neither one of those are an acceptable outcome for a young person that's grown up in our city. And that's on all of us. Again, that's a responsibility that all of us have, and we all want to feel safe and all make this community better.
All right, thank you very much. Great words there. And again, as we near the end of the year, this is no doubt an important discussion and topics that we will continue to follow and address and continue to push this conversation forward.
Thank you to all of our guests for taking part tonight and for their dedication to our community. Thanks to COSI for hosting us here, and thank you for taking the time to watch tonight. Thanks for being here.